Okay, well, nice to see you both. We're going to let the Zoom populate for just 30 seconds or so before we begin. Netta, are you in Jerusalem?
I am.
And Ron, you're in Minneapolis, and I'm in New York. So this is a marvel of 21st century technology that we're having this conversation the way we have the way we do. We try with every issue of SAPIR to have at least three conversations with our authors. I wish we could have more because so many of the essays we run are so outstanding, but we have to pare it to three. And the way these conversations work, if you haven't seen them before, is that we will have between the three of us a conversation for about 40 minutes, 35 minutes, 40 minutes for the hour. We try to start on time and end on time. And then as questions occur to our audience members, we ask, there is a Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And so as questions occur to you, put them in the Q&A. And I always make an effort to go for the harder and more challenging questions. I especially like questions that end with question marks and aren't simply statements. So pithy, short, to the point questions, including aggressive ones. They're always welcome. I have two very distinguished guests who have written, I think, really exceptionally important essays, and I thank you for contributing to the university issue for SAPIR. The second time we have come back to the subject of education, I think exceptionally topical given what has happened at universities with respect to Jewish faculty, Jewish students, Jewish interests, you might say, since last October. So, Ron, let me begin with you, with your colleague at the University of Illinois, Carrie Nelson. You co-wrote an essay for us that really expanded on a statement that you wrote just a few months ago. It was a statement called Against Academic Boycotts. And the statement came in response to a striking, but maybe not entirely surprising change of policy from the American Association of University Professors, the AAUP, really kind of a gold standard among American scholarly associations. They had reversed a longstanding policy of opposing academic boycotts. So, just in a compressed form, if you don't mind, tell us what the new statement, the AAUP's new policy says, and was it long in coming? Were you entirely shocked that this change of policy was came this way and at this particular time?
Thanks, Brett. Thanks for having me on the show event. The AAUP has been fighting the question of academic boycotts for over 20 years now. It is not accidental that the AAUP didn't have a policy on academic boycotts until about 2005, when my co-author Carrie Nelson at the time headed their Committee on Academic Freedom and Tenure. There was at that time, as there would be repeatedly over the years, there was a debate specifically over Israel and its treatment of the Palestinians, and whether that warranted a boycott of Israeli academics whose institutions, it was often charged and still is often charged, are complicit in the oppression of Palestinians. So goes the allegation. And this has been an ongoing battle. Carrie led the effort back in 2005 to have the AAUP be quite opposed to academic boycotts as contrary to the very mission of the university and academic freedom. Within a year of that event, his one of the members of the subcommittee who composed that, Joan Scott of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, publicly reversed her own position. So it's not at all a surprise that this was coming. This has been debated for a long time, and the new leadership of the AUP is much more activist, wishes to make the AUP a fighting union, as they call it. And so we knew this was coming at some point. I should say that the three authors of that statement, Carrie Nelson at Illinois, myself, and Ron Hastner of Berkeley, we actually were in conversation about such a statement when I returned from spending a month in Israel this summer and spoke to my Israeli colleagues at the Hebrew University and so on. And we were, and Carrie, who's really tuned in to what's going on at the AUP, it simply became sort of, we already had a statement, and then the AUP, much to our surprise, issued this change in policy, which says, since you asked me to summarize it, which says, it doesn't endorse a boycott against Israel. It says that boycotts are a legitimate tactic in the attempt to effect peaceful change. And so the AUP simply creates, if you will, the normative space for folks to pursue boycotts if they think it is likely to be tactically effective, in the spirit of advancing the mission of academic freedom.
Netta Barak-Corren, you're at Hebrew University, and you are seeing this from the other end of the spear, so to speak, or the wrong end of the spear. Just in the last few days, Benny Morris, one of the most widely known and respected Israeli historians, historically a man of the left, considered one of Israel's sort of revisionist historians, was told by his colleagues at the University of Leipzig that a planned speech by him would be canceled. The suggestion was that it was being canceled for security reasons, not academic reasons. But one sometimes gets the sense that if the university really wanted to protect a visiting scholar, it would make the effort to do so. That there's a kind of a soft boycott at work here, and I want to ask you, Netta, specifically about this, because you make the case in your essay in SAPIR that there are legal remedies when corresponding institutions, particularly in Europe, which has an association agreement, an academic association agreement with Israel, that there are legal remedies to fight these kinds of boycotts. But I want to ask you a more specific question, which is that I get the impression that what happened at Leipzig, this tactic of saying it's a security issue, amounts to a way of working around the legalities to provide a kind of a patina, a justification for what is turning into a full-scale boycott of Israeli academics. Is that the principal tactic that you observe, or is that only one of several that you're now dealing with?
Thank you, Bret, for the question. It's a good one. We have seen quite a few cases where security reasons are, in fact, a pretext for a boycott of sorts. Although I should say that I think to some extent, and Leipzig is an interesting case because we have seen essentially no cases of boycott in Germany. And German universities have been steadfast supporters of Israeli universities, often offering help, even doubling down on collaborations and joint projects. Just this past week, the Max Planck Institute opened a branch in Jerusalem, in fact. Mm-hmm. So the Leipzig example is rare when it comes to Germany. We have seen it in other places in Europe. But I think it exposes the lack of confidence and perceived helplessness on the part of universities, which does not always align with boycotting intentions, but turn out to be a boycott de facto because the universities show no stamina in dealing with the threats and the perceived threats protesters pose for Israeli speakers and guests. And so we have seen quite a few canceled events and canceled talks due to security concerns, real or perceived, or as a facade. I think not less concerning, perhaps even institutionally more concerning, is the establishment across universities in Europe of quote unquote ethics committees that are put in place often only for projects with Israeli universities or Israeli researchers, and under the guise of, the special concerns about ethics collaborating at this present moment with Israeli colleagues. And what we have seen is that these committees only provide one response, which is there's nothing wrong with the ethicality of your particular project, but we cannot allow for a collaboration with an Israeli colleague to continue at present because it would be unethical given the conflict in Gaza. And this has become a trend in European universities to establish these committees and then to use them to thwart all kinds of research collaborations. And then the third major trend that we see is to try and make Israeli universities somehow collectively liable for the alleged war crimes committed by Israel as a country. And here the argument goes, something along these lines. The universities have students who either served or are serving in the Israeli military. Hence, the argument goes, the universities actively support war crimes because the implicit assumption every soldier is a war criminal potential, and the IDF is an inherently moral organization. This has become quite common. And with every new development in the international law arena, when the ICJ makes a new decision or when the ICC issues all kinds of warrants, that gives another explicit momentum for these kinds of decisions. Thankfully, as I wrote in the column, law plays an interesting role here because in terms of public argument, international law is often weaponized, but in terms of the actual law rule controlling those academic collaborations, you can't actually exit or exclude from those research programs based on these kinds of arguments. And so even though it has been quite intense for our researchers to navigate those international collaborations at present, I do remain optimistic that the long term and also the successes that we have seen on the ground since this started is that when international regulators are involved, like the European Union, like the Horizon program, the ERC program, law is more of a protector than of a weapon against Israeli universities. At least at present, that's the case.
Let me ask you, and maybe this question is for Ron, but Netta, you might know as well. I remember about a year or so ago, I think it's the American Anthropological Association or the scholarly association voted a boycott of Israel. And I had a researcher call them and ask, well, have they boycotted any other country, for example, Russia? And the answer was no. Do either of you know of any instances in which this permission to boycott is being employed against any other country?
Yeah, so actually, the Russian precedent has been one that has been used against Israel as well. So, I mean, perhaps the American Anthropological Association did not boycott Russia, but many universities in Europe had, in fact, boycotted Russia, Russia and Belarus. And some international associations have boycotted universities from these countries as well. Of course, I reject the comparison
Yeah.
And at the same time, I think that political boycotts have no place in science in general. I would never support a boycott of Iran, for example, or Iranian universities. I think that science should be a realm where science speaks. But it is true that Israel is not necessarily the only one that suffers from academic boycotts. But Russia is also quite a rare example. So we don't see boycotts of Syrian universities or Iranian universities or Chinese universities or Saudi universities. There are lots of countries blamed for human rights violations and where, ironically, the universities are not independent at all, but entirely dependent on the oppressive regimes, unlike in Israel, where universities are independent of the Israeli government, regardless of whatever you think about the government, they are independent of it. And yet we don't see boycotts against all of those universities or all of these countries.
Ron, I'd like to talk about sort of broad principles here because the concept of academic freedom is one that essentially was fought for hundreds of years. It's always been somewhat tenuously held. There was no academic freedom when religious there was a kind of denominational control of higher education. We've had periods in American history, especially the Red Scares in the 1920s, 30s through the 1950s and the early 60s, when uh, academic freedom wasn't around. This is a kind of a relatively new principle. And I guess, I mean, this is probably a question that the people participating in this call don't need, know in their bones. But if you were making the case, not to students at the University of Minnesota, but people 30 miles out of Minneapolis, why they should care about academic freedom, why this principle matters, and why it should not be abrogated for any reason, including academic freedom for scholars or scholarship by people or from countries we dislike. What is the elevator pitch? Boy, I'm mixing metaphors, but what's the elevator pitch to fly over country America?
Before I answer that, I just want to say that there is significant pushback in the US against collaborations with one country, right? We're seeing it increasingly, and that is China, right? Largely on national security grounds, right? But it's also some concern about genocide in Xinjiang. So we do see this with the Chinese increasingly, and I had quite a few people, respected colleagues who were not comfortable signing the counter statement because they thought it was too absolute, because they felt that they could not in good conscience sign that and then decline collaborations with Chinese students who might apply on national security grounds. And I think that's sort of an interesting conversation that we might have. Look, we have to take a step back to what is the mission of universities? Why do universities even exist, and why are they a public good? And universities are a public good because they have a core mission, which is the production and dissemination of scholarly knowledge. Right? It is the job of scholars to produce that knowledge and to disseminate it to different audiences, their students, by teaching, as well as to the general public, and even have a responsibility to share that with the general public. Academic freedom is critical to that dual mission. If you care about education, you have to care about academic freedom. Because what does academic freedom mean? It means neither more nor less than the following: that scholars need to be able to produce the scholarly knowledge they wish to research and to disseminate that knowledge without outside interference. Full stop. And in so doing, that is the only way, whenever outside actors get involved, whether it be funders, whether it be government, whether it be outside pressure groups, whether it be university administrators, when they seek to police and curb what scholars study, how they study it, and how they express themselves, we all suffer. We need the world of scholarship to be able to speak truth to power and not to kowtow to power. Now, we shouldn't be naive about that, right? I think all of us who live in the world of the academy, that includes not only Netta and me, but probably many people who have been through the academic system, we know that scholars engage in self-censorship all the time. They care about the good opinion of their colleagues in the discipline. They care about the good opinion of their students, of their funders, of their deans who control their fate, of the policymakers they may wish to influence. And many of them are just cautious careerists, right? And tenure and academic freedom in some sense are wasted on cautious careerists. But the last thing we need, given all of those impediments to advancing scholarly knowledge, are outside actors coming in and saying, this is a no-go for what you may study, and this is a no-go for how you may express it and express it in the classroom. The flip side, which almost nobody talks about, but it's in every code of academic freedom, is the notion of academic responsibility. And that is something that we should talk about as well. Academic responsibility means essentially, yes, I'm free to pursue that scholarly knowledge, but that means I also have to speak the truth, to pursue scholarship with integrity, and to share scholarly knowledge with integrity. I'm ethically bound not to misrepresent what my view is scholarly consensus if it is not. I'm ethically bound not to represent opinion as fact, and I should stay in my lane. That the essence of academic freedom is rooted in the production and dissemination of scholarly knowledge. It is not the same thing as freedom of speech. I have all sorts of opinions that are not grounded in the production and dissemination of scholarly knowledge, and when I express those, I speak as a citizen entitled to freedom of speech, not under the guise and the rubric of academic freedom.
So let me push you, Ron, on this point, because, and then I want to get back to the more Israel-specific side of this conversation.
I want to also have a point on academic freedom after you do
No,
your.
go ahead, and I'll remember my question. Give me an interjection, Netta, please.
So I agree with what Ron said, but I think in the context of the boycott movement, what I see that I find most disturbing about the violations of academic freedom is universities telling their researchers not to do research or to do research in a specific way, and journals that for them, the separation of opinion and fact, as Ron, praised a second ago, is simply inexistent. We have quite a few journals today that are holding special issues on the genocide in Gaza, where the discipline is, literature, humanities, theology, things that have nothing to do and no claim to fact at all, in fact. And yet they feel entirely confident to already, to indict and sentence and do it all over the pages of academic scholarship. And so I think that the complicated questions that I see with respect to the violations of academic freedom and really academic integrity today is the corruption of academia from within. And I might be naive or idealist or simply too young, but I thought that until the past year, I had a better vision of academia than I do have now. I frankly, I weren't expecting university presidents to make the kind of decisions that I have seen them making in the past year. I thought that if we can count on our institutions in one sort of realm to make decisions grounded in reason and evidence, that would be academia. I mean, what is academia for? What does academia stand for if not for this? And yet time and time again, you see universities succumbing to pressure, canceling projects that would benefit humanity that have absolutely nothing to do with the conflict. Or if they have something to do with the conflict, they're about finding ways to have peace in the Middle East. And yet, they get canceled because there is an Israeli partner, regardless of any metric or measure of science. And I think this threat to academic freedom coming from within, it's like an autoimmune disease that is crumbling over academia.
So if I can,
well, let me just quickly say something. I was reviewing, Ron, the list of signatories of your counter letter, and it's a very impressive list. But one of the things that struck me is how many names I recognized because they've been around for a long time. And Netta, in a sense, hinted at this. One gets the sense that there is a generational uh, transition, change, revolution taking place among academics. I mean, when I went to college, the expectation was um, the stronger the provocation, the more fun you could have in a conversation. I now have children in college, and the expectation is keep your mouth shut unless you absolutely have to, and only offer tentative and correct opinions because otherwise you might get into trouble. And I have the sense that something similar has also happened in among faculty. And I want to ask both of you, but maybe starting with you, Ron. Um, do you feel like you are not only swimming against a current here, but that you are representing a view of academia that is kind of slipping into retirement, slipping into the past? Is what we saw from the AAUP a sign of the kind of inevitable direction that the academy is taking just because you have a generation of scholars brought up to believe that academic responsibility, as you pointed out and Netta pointed out, doesn't apply to them. Opinions can be facts. Their role is to be activists, not scholars. Is that the trend and transition that we're seeing or that you're seeing?
So I think that everything that Netta said is exactly right. I certainly don't disagree with it, although maybe things were different in Israel. I wonder where you've been for the last 20 years. Ever since I entered the academy, this has been going on. I don't think that it's inevitable. So I'm not an intellectual historian, but let's just take a little bit of a step back, right? I mean, I think, Bret, you and I are roughly the same age and came of age just sort of at the tail end. Precisely as those norms, why did those norms begin to erode? They've started to erode for a very good reason, because there were important intellectual trends that were not wrong, that observed that scholarship is never neutral. That's true, right? Right? The notion that all facts are theory laden. We are not neutral about what we choose to study. We're not neutral about how we express our research claims and findings. We have to be ethically attentive to the normative implications of our research processes, right? That's sort of the intellectual origin of this. And the whole idea was scholars should be a whole lot self-aware, a whole lot more introspective, and more attentive to their own biases. And that not that there is any possibility of producing in the humanities and portions of the social sciences anything that's inherently, right, this sort of assault on objectivity, right, is I think part of what you are suggesting. That is part of the intellectual current, but it wasn't inevitable, and I don't think that it's irreversible. Which is to say, because scholarship, the danger was not that insight. That insight is powerful, and there's a lot to it, though you and I may disagree, but we can talk about it more. But the danger is that it becomes, when you try to make a virtue out of that vice, when instead of using it to try to hem oneself in, rather scholarship then becomes an exercise in proving what it is we already know to be true, in confirming our priors, rather than in subjecting our premises and beliefs to scrutiny. I don't think that's inevitable. I think that I think there's a lot of pushback. And I think we have a tendency, look, my world is the world of political science. I'm in the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Minnesota. We have the most students, but we are not the biggest, and we are the biggest college, but we are only a small portion of a much larger research university. And as we all know in the United States, at any rate, big science is king. And a lot of the conversations that we're having, they may be a lot of what our listeners should be aware that a lot of what Netta is describing is taking place about the cancellations and so on. A lot of that is Europe, right? We've not seen any American university, as far as I know, Netta, correct me if I'm wrong, engaging in sort of canceling, sort of not permitting collaborations, not permitting individuals to submit grants. We don't have faculty. We have faculty unions who have made some claims. It's not like Australia and the UK. It's really quite different right now. think we're in the midst
Netta,
of
let me just interrupt 1 second, because Netta, I think you have a very good, you have your finger on so much of what's happening. Have you observed, at least at an informal level, boycotts by American universities of Israeli scholars that don't take the name of a boycott, but one gets the distinct whiff of a prejudice at work?
So there was one university, Pomona, at California, whose president made a declaration of boycott, but then was removed from his duty the day after. We had a case with a journal that explicitly said we have a policy of not accepting
at
paper.
my university, no less.
I wanted to say that. So taking responsibility is part of academic integrity, right? No, I'm not holding you responsible. And then the journal, after a few weeks, issued an apology, but did not admit that there was anything wrong, or did not say explicitly that there is no such policy. And we had quite a lot of cancellations and individual level boycotts. So faculty said, refusing to evaluate candidates for tenure, refusing to be part of doctoral committees, some security.
Refusing to evaluate candidates for tenure in Israel, to be clear, not against American academics, just to clarify.
Right. So part of a boycott of Israel, but an individual level boycott. And it's possible that the sort of silent or boycott is more widespread. But in Canada, for example, just a little bit north, we have seen quite a massive movement of boycott. Lots of faculty unions, some universities, some institutions. So it's going on in North America, but thankfully not strong as it is in other places, other parts of the world, in the United States.
It's taking place, as Netta said, at an individual level, which is very different from at an institutional level.
That's right.
And it's very hard when people simply decline. I'm sure sometimes they decline and openly say, I'm not going to because they're Israeli. Sometimes they probably will just say they decline because they're busy, right? And then we never know what the reason is, right? There's lots of good reasons. Academics are busy people that they decline to write letters for promotion and tenure. And it's very hard to tell. The case Netta was alluding to at my institution here at the journal hosted here called Cultural Critique was the rare case where they were actually open about their policy. I think that the reason I think that not all is lost is I think that universities have done, our generation of academics has grown up in a world in which they think that academic freedom is something that is shrouded in the mists of time, right? They're not old enough, unlike my senior colleagues. None of us came of age at the Vietnam War. When I first got here to Minnesota, my senior colleagues understood what some of them had even sort of lived through the McCarthy era, right? They were very old. There were, of course, those who had lived, they knew what academic freedom meant, and they understood academic responsibility. We've done a very poor job within our universities educating our colleagues about academic freedom and about academic responsibility and about the difference between the two. So let me, if I can, take a moment to elaborate for a moment. Right, as I said, academic freedom is that scholarly knowledge is about the production and dissemination of scholarly knowledge. It is not about simply saying whatever I would like to say. And it also means that scholarly knowledge should freely circulate. I think we would all, and probably preaching to the converted on today's session, everybody here would agree with that. And that the only basis for judging scholarship is its scholarly merit. That is very right. Advocates of boycotts claim that boycotts are simply allowing, the AUP says, we're just allowing colleagues to exercise their academic freedom. And that is just a profound misunderstanding. They're allowing them to exercise their freedom of speech, but that has nothing to do with their academic freedom. Under freedom of speech and association, I do not have to listen to the speech of those I find distasteful and immoral. And I don't have to associate with those I find distasteful or immoral. And when individual scholars choose not to do that, they're not exercising academic freedom. They're exercising the freedom of speech and association. And we're also not trained lawyers, unlike Netta. So we are not thinking about the fact that rights are very often in conflict. And in the whole discussion of academic boycotts, I challenge you to find anyone acknowledge the rights, that the academic freedom of the boycotted is being abrogated. And we, of course, whenever rights come into conflict, we need to balance those rights and acknowledge and think through how it is that we think about those different rights. I think there's a profound role for education about the principles of academic freedom and academic responsibility that we in universities in North America, and certainly I would say in our colleagues in Europe all the more so, have really lost sight of.
So before we get to the questions from our audience, I want to take a few minutes at least to turn to the issue of remedies. And Netta, I mean, your article is subtitled "The Legal Remedy." What are the tools that are available? You mentioned that the law is your weapon, not your shield, or I think that was the metaphor you used. What are some of the tools available to Israeli academics to fight this, especially given, as Ron also pointed out, how very easy it is for those who are silently boycotting Israelis to get away with it on some sort of pretext?
Yes, it's a complicated story. I believe I said before that law is often weaponized, but it can also be helpful. And we have going back a few steps to what kind of law is helpful. So essentially, cutting off Israeli scientists from projects, from grants, disinviting them, providing them a less favorable treatment than you provide to other similarly situated scientists is a form of discrimination. And it's a form of national origin discrimination. It's a form of religious discrimination at times. Some boycotting behaviors often become harassment, including physical harassment. And so, the sort of the terms that I already threw in already disclose that there are anti-discrimination laws and anti-harassment laws that are often, at least in theory, and very frequently also in practice, could be shown to be violated in these cases. Importantly, many of the major scientific players, from universities to funding agencies and research institutes, have their own anti-discrimination policies, and they typically oblige all participants to conform to them. So, for example, major funders of American academia, and by the way, not just American academia, but also partners of American academia worldwide, like the NSF or the NIH, have their own anti-discrimination norms, rules, bylaws that all grantees need to sign, and they even have enforcement and compliance offices that people and scientists can complain to if those rights were violated. And on top of
Very
that,
quickly, just so that I understand, let's say a university in Canada makes the decision to boycott their Israeli counterparts, but that university gets money from
the
NIH or an American grant-making institution, and that grant-making institution has anti-discrimination provisions, then that university could be subject to what's the equivalent of secondary sanctions, in which they lose American funding for boycotting Israeli scholars. Is that right?
Yes, or at least that's our argument. And there are good precedents for this argument. Now, in another extension of the argument, there are also in quite a lot of states in the United States and at the federal level, and in a few other countries around the world, there are also specific laws against the boycott of Israel in particular. And so these add another layer of potential legal claims that could be valuable. We could, and we have used, depending on the context, and the tools available to us, depending on the legal regime and the specific facts, we have used quite a few of these tools to fend successfully against boycotts. We have found that even though it's not always helpful, because again, going back to the general shock about university decision-making, turns out that some universities are willing to openly defy their laws, but the applicable laws, but often we found that even just making the legal argument proves to be an efficient deterrent and makes university decision makers to think again about the implications of the boycott and the sanctions that it exposes them to. I should add, though, that it's not always the easy way or the fast way out, and some universities do defy the law. We are currently really looking for the opportunity to also put some new laws in place. So as I alluded to in the piece that I wrote for SAPIR, a decade ago, there were two bills that were put on the floor of the House that where they enacted, they would have extended federal anti-boycott legislation more explicitly to academic institutions. The current legislation covers commercial entities. And just, perhaps related, maybe Bret, you can take credit for it, for publishing the piece, because one of the really interesting developments that happened after I published the piece is that quite a few organizations started to circulate it to congressmen and women in Washington, D.C. And perhaps relatedly, only last week, Congresswoman Virginia Foxx and Congressman Josh Gottheimer put a new bill to extend the anti-boycott legislation to academic settings. And I think that this bill is maybe not the most perfectly worded bill, and I hope it will see some improvements. But this could be important because it could more explicitly extend the anti-discrimination framework of U.S. law to potentially European universities abroad, preventing them explicitly from getting American money, for example, for research, hence creating a deterrent mechanism that would make them think again whether boycott is, a beneficial strategy to advance science.
Something tells me I know exactly the SAPIR reader who might have put your piece into the hands of those members of Congress. And if that SAPIR reader is on this call, I want to thank this person for doing some good. That's terrific news. I'm going to start with questions. And a question here that I think is an extension of our conversation, and I'm going to give it to you, Ron, comes from Mallory Stark, who writes, as a librarian at Harvard, I was particularly saddened to see that faculty and students at Harvard conducted study-ins at Widener and the Harvard Law Library. Unfortunately, these study-ins discouraged Jewish students to enter the reading room at both these libraries. Could you, Ron, comment on the First Amendment is not applicable in this situation, and that students should be protected under Title VI, because Title VI is also now more and more being used to defend Jewish students against discriminatory behavior?
So the First Amendment does not apply to Harvard University. It is a private institution, and Harvard has the right to regulate speech more to some degree as it sees fit. As I understand it, and I'm not a lawyer, the grounds regarding Title VI are shifting beneath our feet, right? That over the course of the last year, the Department of Education has been expanding the application of Title VI legislation in such a way that universities are really quite unsure exactly what it would take to satisfy those Title VI requirements. The librarian at Harvard mentions, it should be noted that the free speech absolutists involved at FIRE were quite disturbed by Harvard. And I will say that I myself found Harvard's position rather strange. Literally, people who positioned on their protest, Brian Enos, a professor of government at Harvard, went into Widener library, and on the top of his laptop had statements from the Harvard Statement of Principles. And he was promptly escorted out of the library and banned for the next 2 weeks. I think that's a little bit excessive. Nobody, I don't think anybody is feeling threatened by somebody having a message on, and shouldn't. Our students have all sorts of political messages on, like, I think we've sort of lost sight of what's at stake here. There are real violations of academic freedom, right? There are real violations that really affect people. There are real things that make people feel unsafe. And I would say, Bret, to your point earlier, we have lost sight, our students have lost sight of the difference between feeling truly threatened and simply being exposed to ideas they do not like. And this is a big problem at the university. And it's a problem, frankly, with our Jewish students as well. They don't know the difference. And my own view is that the proliferation of the language of harm has been remarkably harmful. Right? The idea that if I'm made to feel uncomfortable, I have been harmed and I feel unsafe, nothing is more contrary to the spirit of the university. And I think we all need to get more comfortable. Our Jewish students also, right, who are equally part of that larger American political culture where we're all supposed to feel nicely wrapped up in a lovely, warm, soft cocoon. They too need to start to understand that universities are, as our colleagues at the University of Chicago have rightly said, places where we are supposed to be made uncomfortable and unsettled. Not unsafe, but uncomfortable and unsettled.
Well, speaking of the University of Chicago, the next question comes from Peggy Mason. How should we address the possible participation of university presses in academic boycotts? There are independent editorial boards, and appropriately so. How would a university with a solid academic freedom commitment, such as mine, both Peggy's and mine, I should say, U Chicago, appropriately ensure that journals published by their press are not explicitly or on the down low engaging in an academic boycott? An excellent question from someone who comes from an excellent university, I might say, with a little pride. Netta, do you want to answer that question?
I agree, as a former teacher in U Chicago Law School, that it's an excellent institution. I think the question of publishing houses is really difficult. And it's the difficult question as we see it from the perspective of of the authors. It's a question that's difficult about journals more generally. First, I think the covert boycott is apparently massive, but often there is no way to prove it, because there are lots of desk rejections and unreasoned or unexplained rejections. I think even once explicit, it's often very difficult because lots of the actual publishing houses are seated under major corporations like Wiley and so on, and it's not clear that they're even governed by any kind of university rules, or that the corporations that are the publishing houses have any form of really disciplining or regulating the journals themselves. And it's also the heart of the academic practice, in the form that you can't go into the business of telling journals what to publish and what not to publish. It's like the core of the academic work. So I think it is a really major challenge. I would say that whenever the publishing house is somehow directly connected to the university, and I think the example that Ron and I alluded to before about the journal in Minnesota that was published by, correct me if I'm wrong, Ron, by the essentially housed under the University of Minnesota and supported at least partially by the University of Minnesota. I think that the case is stronger, that the rules of the University of Minnesota should apply to it, and also the kind of threats that it exposes the University of Minnesota to under Minnesota anti-boycott law, under potential federal sanctions for discrimination, also gives a hook for the university to interfere and to change an explicit boycott policy. A silent boycott policy, that's the reason why in general discrimination has been so hard to uproot. once it transforms itself from overt to covert, you have to rely on social norms, and when they are eroded or inexistent, then this is a constant uphill struggle. So I do think, let me not be mistaken to say that I think legal remedies will solve everything. I think we do need to work a lot on academic norms and social norms in academia, and without a sort of collaborative joint approach, we will not be able to really curb the boycott movement for a long while.
If I could just add to that, because I edited a major academic journal for a long time. We were published by one of those big journal farms, Taylor and Francis. My contract with Taylor and Francis required me to affirm that all decisions of the journal would be made on the basis of scholarly merit. So the kind of policy that cultural critique had, which I'm quite sure Minnesota's anti-BDS law played a role, which had it doesn't affect small institutions, but it had a $50,000 limit. And while cultural critique is not that big, the University of Minnesota obviously did have $50,000 of business with the university and then some. If I had any journal that is open and explicit will end up, even under the terms of the contract, is in violation of that contract. Any journal, any press that is always part of their bylaws, right? The decisions need to be made on the merit. The big problem, and as Netta just said, is the silent boycott. The solution to that is a major shift in norms. So for those who are not in the world of the academy, in the sciences, the standard norm is what's called single blind review, which is to say the review, I guess maybe people aren't even aware how this works, right? Articles are sent out to expert peer reviewers who then send their reviews of articles to editors who make the final decision. In the sciences in general, single blind review is very common, meaning that the reviewers know who the author is, but the authors do not know who the reviewer is. In other words, they'll know if someone is an Israeli author. In my field, and in lots of the social sciences, double-blind review is the norm, meaning neither the author nor the editors know who the other person is. Sometimes you have a good guess, but the authors and the reviewers, sometimes you can guess because people work in small areas, but it's not always possible. Where I think we really need to move is toward a system of what I would call triple-blind review. I would say when I was an editor, 60 to 65% of manuscripts were rejected by me without any additional input. It's called what Netta called desk rejection. It's rejected by the editors because, for reasons we can talk about, remarkably overburdened. The editors need to take that kind of discretion, exercise that discretion. I instituted a model which is increasingly widespread in my field, that I did not know the identities of the authors when I made the decision to desk reject. We need to do that a lot more, and that needs to become the norm across all of academia, across the entire world of scholarship.
So the next question comes from Dahlia Sachs, she tells a personal story, which I think is apropos. My daughter happens to hold a leadership position at Macalester, which is a liberal arts college in Minnesota, well-regarded liberal arts college. It's, I guess the position is Mac for Palestine, and has collaborated with University of Minnesota activists, so she may have crossed paths with Professor Krebs. To my dismay, needless to say, I don't think that's meant against you. Question. She and her peers are, quote unquote, demanding that boards of trustees divest from Israel benefiting investments and boycott study abroad programs, claiming that university governance should be democratic. Good thoughts from this panel on how to respond in some persuasive manner. She adds, I have tried but haven't succeeded yet. Netta, Ron, help Dahlia Sachs speak to her daughter.
My kids are younger. I don't know. What do you do?
Just wait.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the divestment and study abroad are not quite the same thing, right? And I think actually they've been brought together by the activists. They've been brought together by activists on both sides. I think they need to be separated, right? The whole divestment debate is at some level a little silly, right? Very few universities have active investments in Israel. They don't really, this is symbolic. more than anything else. And of course, the question is, where does it end, right? Where do you end on this issue of divestment? And by the way, I mean, very, very few boards of trustees, including at Macalester, including at which is in St. Paul, including here at the University of Minnesota, have been prepared, have been willing to go along with those demands, right? It's an extremely rare thing, thankfully, so far. I'm more disturbed by, frankly, the study abroad. I mean, I don't think the universities would be very affected. Frankly, I don't think Israel would be very affected. The divestment is passive, whatever. It's the study abroad that is critical, and to me, directly speaks to questions of academic freedom. No one is better off by cutting themselves off from the circulation of knowledge and ideas. The best thing that you can do, if you are someone who does not like what Israel is doing, the best thing you should do is go to Israel and be able to hear from Israelis. How many students at MAC for Palestine and how many students at the University of Minnesota who are out there protesting in the Quad actually know very much? Now, I want to tell you an optimistic story before we think all is lost in the academy. I'm a political scientist. I teach conflict and security. It's what I do. There's no one debates that I should be talking about the war in Ukraine and the war in Gaza. In fact, it would be criminally negligent if I did not lean in. Many of my colleagues have leaned out. They don't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole. I have many Arab students. I have many Somali students. Last semester, I had 5 young women who wore a hijab in my class. I have had nothing but good experiences modeling in our classroom. How do we talk about settler colonialism? Does this make sense in the context of Israel? How do we talk about foreign imposed regime change? What does that tell us about Gaza? I had a Palestinian student in my class this semester wearing a hijab who just nodded along the whole time. My experience has been that students who are not there, who are activists, who on our campus of 60,000, to be clear, is like 200 students, maybe. On our campus of 60,000, most students just want to learn. And my Somali students, we're the biggest Somali population in America. My Somali students, they are sympathetic to fellow Muslims, but they also know they don't know the history of Somalia, let alone the history of Israel-Palestine. And I had a student last semester come to me and say, Professor Krebs, I don't have time right now, but in June, when I have a little more time, I know I don't know anything about Palestine. What should I read?
I want to actually
Go
add
ahead, Netta. Please add something.
So first, I entirely support what Ron said. And in fact, what we often say is, if you really want to end the war between, Israel and the Palestinians, if you really want to contribute to stable peace, there is no place better for you to learn how to do it than be on the ground and join one of the many institutions for peace studies in Israeli universities or programs specifically focused on conflict resolution. Our universities are super diverse, and you have in our classrooms Palestinians and Israelis, Arabs and Jews, Muslims and Christians and Jews and Druze sitting together and learning about these issues and creating all kinds of collaborative projects on sustainability in the Middle East and lots of other stuff. So that's number one. Number two, I think the point about democracy or democratic decision-making in universities, is important. But we also know from democracy that there is no functioning, stable democracy for and a sustainable one at it without also defending the rights of the minority. And to the extent that what these students want is to interfere with the right of other students to choose to go to Israel, then it's not, a change in university policy that they're seeking. They're seeking to deny an option from others to go and get the education they want. And I think this is deeply undemocratic at that.
We have to end it here. I was just reviewing the questions from Paula Bardak, Randy Skirka, many others that I would have loved to have gotten to, but we don't do our seminars on Jewish time, if I can use a slight stereotype. We try to stick to time. So I apologize that we only were able to get to a few of the questions, but I really want to thank both you, Ron, and you, Netta, for a really superb, illuminating, intelligent, and actually surprisingly optimistic conversation. I come away feeling a little bit better about universities than I did when we started. Netta, in particular, thanks for staying up. I know it's late over there. And thank you to our audience for participating in these conversations, participating in the SAPIR community. Our declared mission is to provide ideas for a thriving Jewish future, and you've provided them abundantly. I hope you have a lovely rest of your week.
Thank you so
Thank you
much.
very much. Good night.
Right.